Welcome to C-Suite Conversations. My name is Patrick Leddin, and each week I have the opportunity to sit down and talk to an executive leader to learn about their life, their work, and their career, the successes they've achieved and the struggles they overcome, all with one thought in mind, to help you, the listener, to learn more about how you can improve the journey you're on. Today I'm joined by Brian Becker. He's a managing partner and CEO of the 18,000-person firm RSM. Brian oversees the firm's strategy and operations across 4 countries, the United States, Canada, El Salvador, and India, and he's an expert in digital transformation. In our conversation today, Brian's going to talk about his journey, what he learned along the way, and also he'll share with us some insights about how we can be more effective, not just with our IQ side of the house, but also with our EQ. Trust me, you're going to want to grab something to write with, sit back and prepare to take some notes as Brian Becker and I have a C-Suite conversation. Brian Becker, thanks so much for joining me for a C-Suite conversation.
Thanks, Patrick. Great to be here.
Great to have you here. You and I had a chance to talk before we hit record, and you were telling me a little bit about your career and especially about the job you had early on in your life and what you learned from that. Why don't you go ahead and tell that story, if you don't mind, to the listeners so they know a little bit about the guy on the other side of the microphone?
Sure. I'm a non-traditional student, so I tell people my dad and mother both came from large families. I have 4 brothers and sisters. But nobody had ever went to college. So when it came time to go to college, I did not know that there was a choice. And I tell people it was like going from grade school to high school. You just assume it, and that's what I assumed. So I went to a small school in northern Iowa, in Cedar Falls, Iowa, and one of the top accounting schools in the country. So naturally, I decided I'd do accounting. But I had to pay my way through school, so I got a job at some place called Radio Shack, which if you're old, you'll know what that is. But it was a commission job, and that's right when computers took off, especially the PC generation. So I'm kind of aging myself, Patrick, but especially networking. So that's at the point when we're starting to network computers together. And so I learned how to do that. So I learned that if I sold computers instead of resistors and radios and VCRs, I made a lot more money. So I learned how to do networking and to help people solve their computer issues, which was unique at the time. And I got to deal with the public. And so I tell everybody that my schooling was great to get my job in accounting, but I learned a lot of life lessons through my years at Radio Shack.
Well, folks, you said you may be dating yourself talking about Radio Shack, but I clearly remember Radio Shack, and I jokingly said to you earlier, and people who've been there probably remember the idea of like Radio Shack. You'd go in and you wanted to buy something, and they wanted your phone number and your home address. They had to fill out a bunch of information. You're like, it's here for batteries. But you're right. At the time, Radio Shack sold a lot of different tools, and computers were kind of just we're just starting to really show up on people's desks. And I recall they were really kind of the nerd squad, if you will, before there was a nerd squad. No offense, but they had the ability to fix computers and connect computers and do all those things you're talking about.
Listen, if today you go to Best Buy or Costco, or you can go anywhere and get all these electronics, big TVs. Back in the day, there wasn't a lot of places to go. You had to go to a Radio Shack to get the big speakers and the big sound systems, and then computers kind of took off. So it was a great spot to be because I was on the front end of the IT revolution, so to speak.
It's interesting. A lot of people who listen to the podcast, although it's called C-Suite Conversations, they're not always people in the C-Suite. I mean, there are people in the C-Suite who are like, I'd love some insight from Brian about how I can deal with this culture issue or this technology issue or this hyper growth issue I'm dealing with. There's certainly people listening from that perspective, but there's a lot of other people elsewhere in their career path. Maybe they're really early on. Maybe they're in school. Maybe they're working in today's version of Radio Shack, and they're kind of starting to learn new things and figure out their own path in life. I'd just be curious before we move on from that experience, because it sounds like it was so foundational to you. From your perspective, what's the value of some of those early on jobs?
I just think dealing with the public, I see obviously with the pandemic, before I worked at Radio Shack, when I was in high school, I was a cook and a waiter. I just think when you deal with the public, you learn how different everybody is, but also how much the same we all are. And I just think it's great experience, and you learn to have conversations and you just learn the social aspect, because a lot of your job, whether you realize it or not, is more EQ than just IQ. I definitely would not be here if it was IQ only. It's because of EQ and kind of knowing how to help people be successful. And there's a personality, emotional aspect of that, along with the IQ aspect.
Yeah, I love that, the idea of helping people be successful. One thing I noticed as I was looking through your career, reading through your bio, learning a bit about your organization, is you've been really successful. You've dealt with a lot of rapid growth, hyper growth, people might say, and also just kind of on the cutting edge of some of the changes in regard to technology and people. So if you wouldn't mind, tell us a little bit about RSM.
Yeah, I mean, I joined as an auditor, and I think I was a good auditor, but it wasn't my passion. I learned my passion was dealing with the technology side. But one thing being an auditor did for me is kind of the language of business. So I learned that implementing technology, whether it's today or back when I started, is always about how you align people, process, and technology. And I found a lot of my competitors were all about technology or bits or bytes or ones and zeros. And I always approached it that technology is just a tool, Patrick. So if I always used to tell my clients, if you don't deal with process or put people in the right roles, then technology just has you do the wrong thing faster. And so it's very important that you realize that when you're doing technology, whether it's, today it's obviously AI or however you define AI, it's very important and critical that you always align what people do and how they do it and what their role is, and then obviously adjust the process. And that's been my whole career. It's how you align those three things.
As you were going through that, I jotted down two different names that people who are familiar with Franklin Covey would know these names just because they've seen it in our content. We have partnerships over the years with these people, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on a couple things. The first one is you talked about the language of business, and Ram Charan wrote a book years ago called What the CEO Wants You to Know, and we've had a chance to partner with him and in the past and develop content around the idea of like understanding the language of business. So we'd say like understanding cash and margin and velocity and growth and customers. That's one thing I'd like to hear you talk about, just understanding the language and how important that is. And then secondly, as you were talking about technologies, just a tool, it reminded me of Clayton Christensen and the work they did around job to be done and understanding what is the job that you're hired to do? What is the job that you're hiring this technology to do? If we could kind of parse those two apart, I'd just love to hear your thoughts on it. So first part, like we would say that like the language of business, senior leadership, CEOs, people like yourself, you talk a particular language. And sometimes employees don't know that language that well. And it's almost like there's a missing opportunity to translate like why the project I'm working on at work, why that matters, boss, to the business or whatever it might be. So you probably bump into team members all the time, and I bet you a lot of them know the language of business. But what's the value of like learning that language?
Well, it's really understanding how you fit in the purpose of things, and we want people at RSM to have the same passion for our company as they do for their favorite sports team, as an example. And so, if you think about it, try to whether you're an associate or you're a partner in our business, try to understand where you fit and the impact that you're having. I mean, business is ultimately about, for us, are you helping your client really change their position and really achieve their goals and objectives, which means, are you growing? Because if you're not growing, you're dying typically. And are you doing it in a way where you're generating the right amount of cash flow and the amount of activity that you can train and develop people to the next level? So an associate on an audit has to understand they're on the front lines, and on audit, for example, society is trusting you as you analyze that business. Their stakeholders are trusting you. Their owners are trusting you to help them make sure that what they're seeing is correct and right. And And it's not just looking at invoices, Patrick, and just matching up accounts payables and things like that. But you might be the one that finds an issue that could really turn that company around or prevent it from going the wrong direction.
Oh, that's a great point about, being the one who sees something that can turn the company around. I think that if as any employee, regardless of your role, you might be the newest person in the organization, a little bit higher, lower down in the hierarchical structure. You might be further up, wherever you are. It doesn't really matter. If you're listening to this right now, know that it's really critical that you understand how your business makes money and understand your role in basically adding to the margin or draining the margin, and it can show up in any kind of role. So it's a matter of, if I'm delivering the mail in the office, do I hold on to checks that are coming in a couple extra days, and does that hurt us if we're still in the paper-based system? Or if I'm booking travel, am I doing it 2 weeks in advance, or I'm waiting to the last day? I mean, everybody plays a role. Is it fair, Brian, in understanding like how the company makes money, how the organization functions, and how they can contribute to it?
Yeah, and part of the language of business is nobody will typically say, I want new software. Okay, Patrick? Usually it's, wow, my inventory turns are not where they should be. I don't understand why I'm falling behind, or I don't seem to be able to market the same. Like I'm not getting the same lead generation I used to. And so you have to look at those things and say, well, how are you doing your leads? Because a lot of lead generation nowadays is done digitally. And have you modified, or do you have the systems to really analyze your customers? And so a lot of the, I had somebody teach me one time, when you're running, you don't just pull a hamstring right away. There's usually like a tug in your leg. You start feeling the pain. You start feeling the tightness. That's when you have to really help a client or yourself, because the symptoms are the language of business. How you solve that might ultimately be technology, or it might be taxes in our case, or accounting or audit. But it starts with, what is that symptom? And that symptom is almost always through a business issue.
Yeah, so the idea, the Ram Shriram part about the language of business, like you brought up, and then the other part I think bridges back to what you were just talking about there around the Clayton Christensen, the job to be done, because you might see the symptoms showing up in the numbers of business or the language of business, but how do you partner here's what the technology can do for you for customer A, as opposed to understanding what customer A really needs? How do you bring that kind of inquisitiveness, curiosity into the conversation to keep it from just being, oh, I heard one symptom, therefore I'm going to give you this solution. Maybe it's just because we love this solution, not because it's the right one. How do you understand really what is the job that you're being hired to do?
Yeah, I think it always starts with having people take a step back, because sometimes their role can be isolated in what I'll call the value chain. If you're looking from order to cash, for example, there's a flow on how you might take an order or first get a customer interested in buying something to when you finally get paid for it. But a symptom might occur in that process with what somebody is doing. But if you don't step back and look at that entire flow of how things work, then you could very easily miss something that's really critical to what could be the ultimate success. So even today with AI, I used to use this analogy, Patrick, is if you've ever been in a car and you get on a one-lane road, you're only going to go as fast as the car in front of you, right? So if you're driving up a mountain, I did on vacation a couple summers ago, you could have 30 cars. You're only going to go as fast as the fastest car on this road, because there's no passing. So you could automate something with AI and get really fast at one part of the process, but if you don't consider the whole flow, you're not really accomplishing anything, because you're only going to go as fast as that process. So you really have to take a step back and analyze what are the different things affecting the workflow or the role that you're doing, and what other things are attached to that. And that's what I really learned as part of an integrated firm like we have, with audit, accounting, and technology. And that's where I grew up, because I quickly learned that technology is a tool, And again, if you don't have people in the right roles, and if you don't have the processes changed, then you're just going to run into a brick wall. And that happens so many times in our own business. We make the same mistake, Patrick, because people inherently want to do what they've always done, and you really have to help people understand how to change the way you do things to make the technology effective.
One thing I was reading in your bio, and I just love to tap into this a little bit because you're right. Change can be challenging. People are comfortable doing what they're doing. But when I read in your bio, when you were the RSM's consulting leader, you tripled the size of the practice in 5 years. And when I see something like that, I'm like, that's awesome. Congratulations. That's wonderful you're able to do that. But I also think like, oh my goodness, what did it feel like to be in those shoes and have that hyper growth like that and have to work with people to maybe make them uncomfortable a little bit and try some new things and then bring new people into the team? And what did that hyper growth teach you about the pros and cons of it as you went through it? I'd just love to hear you just kind of reflect on that.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's fun. So we always said you work hard, play hard. So the hyper growth is fun. You sure learn about scale very quickly because as you get larger, there's different scale involved. But you just have to constantly reinvent yourself. And I came up on the technology side, and obviously that was a fast moving. And the great news is, I remember when I started, again, this is dating me, but we did a lot of desktop support. And I remember when the tools came in where you can remotely go in and fix your desktops, and eventually that's not needed. I remember saying, well, we're going to lose 75% of our consulting people because what are they going to do? And what I learned is that technology enables the need for more people and more insights. And in my career, Patrick, not once has any technology initiative taken away the need for people. In fact, it's increased it. And so as long as you're not afraid to continue to innovate and continue to move forward, then the growth is there. As long as you're willing to just see where the people and your businesses and your customers are going. There's that old quote, which is overused, but I can't help but using it. We always skated to where the puck is going, not to where it's at. I think it was Wayne Gretzky that said, others skate to where the puck is at. I skate to where it's going.
As I'm thinking about that, when you talk about skate to where the puck is going back to the conversation you were having earlier, the words you shared earlier around people, process, and technology, how do you envision it when you're growing the consulting practice, or right now as leading the organization? Do you see these as like, this is not the right analogy probably, but like there's these three horses in the race, or these three levers I'm going to pull on, or how do you see the kind of interaction of people, process, and technology, and what happens when one of them is slowing you down going up that mountain?
You just have to recognize when things are ready, and it's best for me to go back in history a little bit. So when cloud computing was first being talked about, everybody talked about cloud computing. But I knew it wasn't ready yet because the scale wasn't there yet. And there was still a psychological thing where people needed to see their servers physically. So there's a psychological effect. The technology wasn't ready. But I knew that it didn't make sense for a software provider to send out 1,000 CDs to update 1,000 customers, right? You knew that cloud computing, being able to do that fix once and then have it available to everybody instantaneously, you knew it was a matter of time when that was going to be taking over the world. The key is if you move too fast, you could crash and burn. But when it was ready, you need to jump on it. So what I always did, Patrick, is, in that example, when did I see cloud computing really being stable enough? When was it secure enough? I'll go back to my process flow. You can have a great data center, but if you don't have the fiber and the wide area networking capable of carrying it to a business at scale, it didn't matter. And for the longest time, you didn't have the infrastructure to support the kind of internet bandwidth you need. And so you had to wait till that was connected. And to me, it just comes naturally to look at that whole value chain and see how does all that fit together, and then kind of know when you see that it is able to work, then you jump all over it. And that's when you have a happy client and a happy customer.
When you talk about happy clients,
I don't know if any of this
no,
makes
it does.
sense.
And you're talking about happy clients, happy customers. I'm also thinking about happy employees. I'm just thinking like the people side of that equation. We were talking about people, process, and technology. You probably have people that you're leading and engaged in that are kind of all over the spectrum, right? You have people who are, by spectrum, I mean like adoption of technology. So you may have some people who are like, come on, Brian, we need to do this. Haven't you heard about this? They're, in the old days, they'd be putting the PC magazine underneath your door. And then you have, people on the other end who think, oh, gosh, it's taking away my job. And then you have customers who might be a little bit mixed on both sides of things. I mean, how do you help bring that people through the process? If you've gone through a couple big waves of technology, and what has that taught you as a leader about leading people through those type of changes?
It's at the ground. I'm sure if any of my employees are watching this, they're saying, do you listen to yourself? Because we're in a lot of change right now, and it's not smooth. So one thing, it's always bumpy. Even if you do everything right, it's going to be a really bumpy change. But what you have to do is give people the why, and you have to constantly go back to the why you're doing this. Not this is what you must do, or this is your role, but also why. Why do we have you not doing these couple of things that you did before, but we're asking you to do these new things? And a lot of times that's because of the technology that we're using, and that's tough because it's not that human beings don't like to change. I mean, we change ourselves all the time when it's something we want to change, but when it's unknown, when people can't see the benefit as readily, that's when people fight the change. So to me, it's constantly going to the why, making sure people understand the why we're doing it, and even then, it's going to be bumpy.
So yeah, it's going to be bumpy, and experience teaches you a bit of that, right? Because you go through a few bumpy rides, you realize, okay, this is how we're going to get through it. If I can communicate the why a little bit clearer, maybe we'll be able to kind of hang in there for the journey with me. We teach a course at Franklin Covey on change, and we talk about the idea that, which you're probably familiar with, you're in the status quo, and then this change comes, and there's this kind of moment where performance starts to fall off, adoption is a little bit slow, and then over time you'll pick up on the other end and hopefully go to a better place over time. But that one part where you're kind of trying to get people to adopt something new and it feels awkward, it feels uncomfortable, and people are saying, why are we doing it, and all that, it's oftentimes not a real smooth roll you're going through. It's a bit of a roller coaster. And some days you feel like they got it, and then they pull back on you, and there's that thing going on. What have you learned through that, Brian? If somebody's listening right now and they're trying to take their team or their organization through a change, and they're in that messy spot where it just feels like adoption's not coming quick enough, or people are pushing back, and the natural tendency for some people is go, okay, scrap it, we'll go back to where we were. But what would you tell them to, hang in there, hang in there a little bit longer, because it's gonna work out?
You just said it. It's a lot of times it's hang in there. Don't give up. It's worth it. Be encouraged. And anything in life worth having is never easy. Sometimes you win the lottery, but even that's not easy if you look at the success of people who win the lottery. Working for it and getting that experience, whether it's dieting or getting ready for a 5K, you could use all the analogies you want. It's bumpy, and there comes a time when you wonder if it's worth being on what I call the treadmill to get in shape. And you have to tell yourself there's a reason you're doing it, and that reason is going to be the right ones as you go forward. And sometimes you make mistakes, especially with technology. People don't love to gather requirements. I like to say a lot of clients, when you say 2 years earlier, we're going to put in a new system, or we're going to do AI, let's get your best people so that we can plan this out. And who do you get? A lot of people send, well, who's on the bench, or who can I spare? And no offense, Patrick, but a lot of times they're not the right people to be designing your future. It's almost like if you had your children work with the architect to do the blueprint of your house, then you wonder when it's being built why it's not what you wanted as an adult. So, so the ability to have agility, to course correct, that's always a key thing. We can always course correct. A lot of what we're doing is not bet the firm decisions. It's what we think is right, and we'll course correct and help us. Help us help you, and lead from where you are. I think that's one of the things that we've said to our people in our business: lead from where you are. You can be a leader any position you are at the firm if you're helping us get better.
One thing I love too, and I love that about helping us get better, and just kind of learning along the way. I'd imagine you learned a lot of lessons along the way. We talked about Radio Shack. Let's take us to the current state. What if anything surprised you when you became the CEO of a company?
Just accounting hasn't been disrupted for 90 years. We've been around since 1926, and now our industry is being disrupted, especially on the accounting and tax side. So, just the difficulty. It's really difficult when you've been doing the same, I'll call it rate times hour type model. We're on a digital transformation at our firm, and the future of our business is applying digital insight with human insight. So I think the future is these great digital tools, but you also need the human insight, the human expertise. And I just read, I'm going to get this wrong, so don't quote me, but it's the Asian game, and they had a computer finally beat the best Go players, and that's a very complex game. It's harder than chess. Mm-hmm. But then they had somebody beat the computer. You know how they beat the computer, Patrick? It was the human using the computer together learned how to beat the computer. The human insight with the computer technology beat the computer every time. And that's what I think the future is going to be. The combination of human insight with technology is where we need to go as a firm.
As you were talking about that, I was thinking about with process automation and things that are impacting the accounting. I was working with somebody one time, and they were talking about the challenge they were having. And this gets back to that change conversation a bit, though. There were people who were accountants. They would do a lot of consulting external consulting, and they were seeing all this process automation come in. And the message they were saying is, hey, this is great. By automating certain processes around debits and credits, that allows you to do higher level thinking and to be able to provide more advice and counsel to your clients. But they also had some people that said, that sounds interesting, but I liked what I was doing before. So again, I know it's back to the change thing, but it's so real in your world right now, in the world of so many leaders right now. I mean, how do you help upskill your workforce, or help your workforce prepare for that next iteration of what business looks like?
Yeah, I think to further our growth trajectory, like you said, we've been on a great trajectory, and we just crossed 4 billion and 18,000 employees. But if we want to get to 6 and 8 billion, then we still have to be really good at looking backwards to make sure and verify and validate, in terms of accounting and tax, was that right? But I think our people also want us to look forward and what's ahead, and what can we glean from the data and the analytics. And again, our knowledge of the language of business, and combining that with the technology. Can we help them look forward? Can we help them look around the corner ahead? And really combine, which I think is a very unique skill set, which is people that actually know how a business runs, how cash flow works, how debt works, how capital works. and combine that again with the tool of technology and the automation of technology. And I think when people realize that, they're going to get excited. That because guess what? I think our clients want that. I think our clients value the backwards looking and validation, but I think they're going to get even more excited to the extent that we can help them look forward.
I love that. Well, hey, Brian, thanks so much for joining me. I just want to end right on that note. That was great as you kind of painted the picture of what's possible going forward. I really appreciate you joining us today. One final question I have for you as we wrap up is there's people that are in all spots on the journey, right? They're early on in their career. Maybe they're in the C-suite. Maybe they're somewhere along the way and they aspire to move up, regardless of where they are in their journey. Like if you were to say, here's one thing that I think, regardless of where you are, would be beneficial, what would you suggest that one thing is that they do?
I'm going to go away from my pat answer, which I think the secret to any career is always learning and reinventing yourself. And that's the number one skill set. But I think going forward, embrace the EQ part of your life. You know, there's all kinds of IQ, there's all kinds of technology. You can be really good at it, but embrace what we call the 5 C's. And we call it, you know, below the line, like learn how to care. The 5 C's for us is, do you care about people and do they sense that you care? Do you collaborate well with others? Because a lot of people don't collaborate very well anymore, Patrick. And collaboration is so important. And are you curious? Are you curious and will you ask the right questions and really understand? That's our brand promise, the power of being understood. So you have to be curious. And then you apply critical thinking to those problems. And then the last C is my favorite, is you need to be courageous. Be courageous. Don't sit quiet. Because if you're curious and caring and you understand, you apply critical thinking, but you don't have the courage to say, Patrick, this is where you could think differently, then it's all for naught. So I think too many times people are on the IQ side and they need to be on the EQ side and think of the 5 C's.
That is so well said. Folks, I'm going to remind you before we wrap up, I'll tell you those 5 again, just in case you didn't jot them down. But Brian, thanks so much for sharing those. Those are so insightful, right? The ability to care and collaborate and be curious, and the critical thinking part, as well as courage. We talk oftentimes at Franklin Covey about having courage and consideration and the willingness to be able to say something that needs to be said in a way that it'll be received. That's so critical. So thank you so much for sharing today. Thanks for joining us. And this has been an awesome C-suite conversation. It's because you brought some great ideas to the table. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Patrick. Loved it. Take care.
Well, folks, that's all I have for today's episode. Big thanks to Brian Becker for sharing his insights with us in his career and what he's learned along the way. And let me remind you of the 5 C's he mentioned. You have to care. You have to collaborate. You need to be curious. You need to be critical in your thinking. And lastly, you need to be courageous. Thanks so much for joining me. My name is Dr. Patrick Leddin. Now go make it a great day.